Welcome to Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston, PhD. Dr. Glenn is a clinical psychologist and former multi-million-dollar consultant to the big food industry and uses his experience to help you defeat your cravings. This show will help you to focus on dramatically reducing cravings and leaving the diet mentality behind, so you can more easily and effortlessly achieve your health, fitness, and body composition goals. Please remember, no doctor-patient relationship is created via this show, and you are responsible for confirming any changes to your diet, health, or psychological routines with an appropriately licensed professional before implementing them. Before we get started, if you haven't downloaded the free smartphone app to access dozens of these recordings all in one place, as well as to avail yourself of a confidential community for support, motivation, and assistance, please visit the podcast link on defeatyourcravings.com as soon as possible. And now, here's your host, Dr. Glenn Livingston.
Hey, it's the very good Dr. Glenn Livingston with defeatyourcravings.com. And I am here with Emily, who's a kind-hearted woman that's agreed to share her coaching session so that you can benefit from her strength and wisdom and experience and hope, as well as her trials and tribulations and stumbles and falls. Right, Emily?
Right.
Catch me up a little bit. This is the first time we're speaking, and I don't even know if you've been through my programs or anything like that. Tell me what drew you to me and how your struggles are with food. Has the book helped you in any way?
I've got an extensive history with eating and food behaviors. Like most people I've heard on your podcast, kind of as long as I can remember. Overeating and sneaking food. And it kind of turned the other way when I was in high school. I became anorexic. I didn't even realize it until I was hospitalized for a few days for malnutrition. I was put in rehab, and I was very particular with what I ate and very restrictive for about 13 years. And then over the past 4 years, it completely reversed to kind of more what you're familiar with, more of the binge eating, a lot of weight gain, and I've tried a lot of different therapies. I've done CBT, I've just done talk therapy, I've read Brain Over Binge, but with different stressors. I'm also in school right now. It creeps up in different ways, and I have not been able to beat it. I found you after doing some research online, and totally new concept. I really like a lot of the ideas behind it. I did buy your workbook. I just haven't started it yet. There's a couple of things I wanted to talk about today in terms of your philosophy.
Okay. So I will definitely talk about anything you want to talk to me about. And I just want to, for the purpose of anybody listening, know that if you are over-restricting or, are showing signs of malnourishment, although we very well might help you with some of those behaviors, that this isn't a treatment for anorexia. It's actually not even a treatment for binge eating disorder. It's a set of information that hangs together really well. And yada, yada, yada. Coffee is hot and done enough CYA. But I do want to make sure that people have the appropriate treatment team in place if you're struggling with any kind of serious eating disorder. Okay. That said, I'm sorry for that. It's required when you're talking to the masses. Tell me what you want to talk to me about. How can I help?
I can learn more about your book by reading it, and I will do that. I've listened to a couple podcasts just on my way to work and such, and I'm really curious about, I know you mentioned the pig in terms of that is how we defeat a craving, and that is kind of the voice that we speak to when we're trying to set rules or change our behavior. So I'm a student. It's my last year. I'm studying psych mental health for nurse practitioner. And I really love your philosophy. It's the newest thing that I've heard of and the limited amount of information that I know. I'm just wondering, I haven't dove into it much yet because have you heard of IFS or parts work before?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to kindly implement that into parts work? Because I feel like for me personally, and then even as a future practitioner, how can I share my journey and educate people, maybe just share them your thought process, and not people with active disorders, people who struggle with binge eating as something different that might be effective, but in a safe way where it's not a bad thing or it's a part of you that we can gracefully experience but not throw names at. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I gave that an awful lot of thought before I started teaching about this publicly. And there is a chapter in the book that's, by the way, I'm glad you didn't read the book because it's good to have someone's perspective who hasn't read it yet, because there are a lot of people who haven't read it yet. First of all, you don't have to call it a pig. If it bothers you to call it a pig, then you don't have to do that. It's different than parts work. My father was a Gestalt psychologist, and I was trained in that originally. And I really understand the philosophy and the benefit of looking at your shadow, embracing the different thoughts and feelings that you might have disowned before. But most of those thoughts and feelings are part of your personality, which resides mostly in the neocortex, maybe in the mammalian brain a little bit. It doesn't really reside in the reptilian brain. So the problem we have is that the reptilian brain, it's not a mammal. It doesn't really operate from a place of love, and it operates from a place of perceived emergency. It has the capacity to push our rational thinking aside. We need a way to recognize when the reptilian brain is active so we can wake up and say, oh my God, who's in charge here? I don't want that thing in charge of me. And we need a way to really separate. It's like this is less about integrating. And I believe in that type of work, by the way. I do believe there are many disowned parts of the self. I don't think it helps that much with eating disorders. But the definition of a squeal, for example, a squeal is anything the pig might say, are thoughts, feelings, impulses, or images that would suggest that you break your well-considered food plan. It doesn't really have your best interest at heart. And I find that when people are reluctant to embrace this, then the philosophy doesn't really work for them. I want the best for you. I want something to work for you. And if you feel like the parts work is what's going to work for you, then I wouldn't take you a lot further in this because I don't want to push you to do something that you don't want to do or that you feel hurts you. You sound like a nice person and you deserve to find recovery. But it really is at the foundation of the method to separate your constructive versus destructive thoughts about food and to be more of an alpha dog and put the reptilian brain in its place. I'll pause and ask what you're thinking about that.
I love that. And honestly, for me personally, I like just owning things up front and getting a game plan. It was just thinking because this field for me coming up, I'm going to prescribe medication and go into psychiatry, which is very new. I graduate in December, and through that stress and the learning of DSM and all these other things, and with my own journey, I just had a lot of thoughts come up. And then after looking at your philosophy, I love it for myself. I want it to be something that I'd also advertise. Not for everybody, but if something works for me and, we can share our story piece by piece.
You could talk about the angel and the devil on your shoulder. That's a little softer way to talk about it. And how do you work it out so the angel wins every time?
Okay. And it's less about speaking to other people, but more of, I think, me just justifying, not like I really care, but if someone were to ask me, and like, we all have parts of ourselves. And I guess I've learned more about parts work. And I do agree that with an eating disorder, there's a different technique for everybody. It's complicated. I like how you explained that mammal doesn't operate from a place from love. And then going off of that, I'm sure you are, but are you familiar with when you do restrict for a long time, you do go the other way, and kind of what part of our brain isn't responsible for that?
Well, it's very dangerous to restrict for a long time. I believe it's the same part of the brain. I'm not familiar with the studies on that as much. I believe that the restriction is actually a setup for the binge.
Yes. And because of that, are the rules that you set, such as rules for your pig, is that related at all in your experience to restriction? Or is that.
Yes. Yes.
And my fear is doing these rules and then one day kind of waking up like I did years ago and they just kind of go down the drain.
That's a different question. Everybody's frightened of that. With you, I'm just going to call it the reptile.
Okay.
Everybody's reptile tells them that you could concentrate on this for a little while, but eventually you're going to forget about it. The solution to that is to remember that you can only eat healthy in the present. It's the only time you can feed yourself. And if you flex your binge-free now muscle every time you have a thought about possibly binging, then your binge-free now muscle is going to get stronger and stronger over time. And so your ability to eat binge-free in the future is going to be better, not worse. The pig wants to focus you on the future as a method of destabilizing your confidence and introducing uncertainty, which will wear you down eventually. The solution is to really just focus on eating healthy in the present over and over and over again. Then it's always the present, and so you don't have to worry. And the reptile doesn't really have a time machine anyway. It can't really see the future. What do you think about that?
I really do like that. Is this like a personality thing, do you think, with the whole like reptile or pig destabilizing confidence? Because I know you've mentioned in some podcasts everybody has one. It seems like some people don't. I'm just wondering, like over time as we build confidence, I think you've mentioned, I could be wrong, like the squeals get softer.
That the rules get softer, is that what you're saying?
The squeals get softer.
Oh, yeah. There are two questions in there. And I want to circle back to something you said about self-esteem and confidence and using this technique at all. So does everybody have a reptile inside of them? Only if they want to. This is a trick of mind you can choose to implement or not. Everybody has a reptilian brain inside of them, unless they've had a brain injury or an operation or something. Everybody has a mammalian brain and a neocortex. But the concept of having a reptile inside of you that says these nasty things and talks you out of your best thinking, it's a game that we play. I don't really think that there's a reptile inside me. I don't really think that there's a separate entity that says all these things, but I've chosen to organize my thoughts in such a way that I think of the reptile as that constellation of thoughts that suggest I should break my rules. And that's very helpful to me because I can immediately recognize when it's active. See, without that, those destructive thoughts were slipping by me all the time, and I didn't recognize what was happening.
Okay.
Now, the second question you asked, do the squeals get softer over time? Yeah. When I adopted the rule that said I would never have chocolate again, which took me a long time to adopt, I went through all kinds of permutations of trying to have it on Sundays and only after a workout and only after my sister's cousin's parakeet's birthday. But eventually I said I will never have chocolate again because I just couldn't seem to control it. And for about 30 days, I really had loud squeals. There's something called the extinction curve where there's a little honeymoon period and then there's a burst of activity. But if you don't reward it, then eventually the squeals get softer because it would be a waste of the energy for the brain to pursue something that you're never going to give it. The purpose of the squeal is to motivate you to go find calories or nutrition. That's the purpose of the squeal. In the modern food environment, that doesn't work well. But 100,000 years ago, that part of the brain really served to protect us and make sure we survived. And it doesn't want to waste energy. It's going to back off if you don't reward the associations. Can I say one more thing about it? I know I'm talking a lot and you have more to say, but I just want
Oh,
to...
no. This is more than I could want. This is like a coaching session right here. So whatever you got.
Cravings are connected to food signals. The signal could be donut store sign. It could be the chocolate bar wrapper. It could be the smell of the coffee at Starbucks. It could be sitting down with your mom to have Saturday morning breakfast and the smell of her house. Cravings are connected to very specific signals. And if you think about the brain as a food acquisition machine, calorie acquisition machine, that makes sense because the brain is very attentive to signals that might suggest that it's going to be easier to find calories. Like if you see a Starbucks sign, you know that it's not going to take an awful lot of effort to go in and get a chocolate bar and a cup of coffee. In primitive times, if a caveman or a cavewoman saw some honeybees, they might be able to follow to the nest and take some of the honey. And so they would start to salivate when they saw the honeybee, just like you start to salivate when you see the Starbucks sign. So when you make a rule, let's say, I won't have coffee more than 3 times per calendar week, or let's make it even more specific. Let's say I'll only have coffee on Wednesdays and Saturdays. You start to extinguish the craving on anything but Wednesday and Saturday because you're only associating the availability with Wednesday and Saturdays. Eventually, you won't have cravings as you pass the Starbucks signs on Wednesday and Saturdays. But if you don't go to your mom's house that often and all of a sudden you go to your mom's house, you might suddenly have a craving because you haven't had the extinction exposures. Like you got to see the Starbucks sign and not have coffee 20 or 30 times. You didn't get to be in your mom's house 20 or 30 times and not have coffee. But as time goes by, if you stick to those routines, then the reptilian brain gives up. It doesn't erase the craving, but it labels it as dormant and it won't waste energy bothering you with it unless you show it that the reward is available again.
Okay.
Sometimes, Emily, people start with a set of rules that they work with and they work the system until their cravings are largely gone. And then they soften up their rules and they start to rely more on mindfulness and intuitive eating and that kind of thing. Sometimes people can do that. The last thing I want to say about food rules and separating your thoughts like this is that when you do it correctly, it tends to enhance your self-esteem more so than detract from it. Because it's kind of like when a kid gains the confidence that they're only going to go potty in the bathroom. I'm a big boy now, I'm a big girl now, right? All of a sudden you can control an impulse that you couldn't control before. that's associated with an increase in self-esteem, not a decrease. Okay, so I'm over talking and you have things to say. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you're not at all. Thank you. Yeah, and kind of going off what you said, all of these behaviors, like it bleeds into everything in life. Overdoing it or underdoing it, it does seem to kind of repeat itself in other facets. I have two questions going off what you said, and then I'll try not to ask too many more. You mentioned that it took about 30 days for your pig squeals to quiet down with the chocolate. My first question for that is, did anything else come up or get in the way? Like, if we're not using food, is there anything else that may have come up in terms of what we lean on if we're not getting our craving met?
Yes, very much.
I could wait to ask my next question too.
Do you want to finish? Is it related?
Not really.
Okay. First of all, you'll get tiny spikes. It's not days, it's exposures. So for a daily habit, you get 30 exposures in 30 days, like going to Starbucks every day. But if it's a weekly habit, it takes longer to extinguish. Okay, so for me with chocolate was a daily habit. And I was like 80 to 90% done with it in 30 days. I wasn't really being bothered. Around 2 months, I felt like it was hardly ever a craving at all. And a year and a half after that, I felt like I didn't really know why I liked chocolate in the first place. Just looks like a big bag of chemicals. Now, if I went and I had a bar, I'd be resetting that whole curve and have to go through it again. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question is what else matters?
Well, what else got in the way? Like, let's say you're not having your chocolate. Were you more irritable? And probably, but I'm just wondering, like, if we're not going to reach our craving, what is this going to make up for it? And that's kind of a fear.
It's an important fear because I understand the impulse to push aside your best thinking and just binge. I understand that to be driven by organismic distress. It's like the reptilian brain is saying, we have a perceived emergency here. Either we haven't had enough good nutrition or enough sleep or enough social contact, or we're making too many decisions, there's too much impinging on us, or we're dehydrated. There's some type of organismic distress and we need more resources. And we better do something. So that's the key. It puts us into a state of doing rather than kind of saying we can just be in a state of being and rest and digest and think about things and comply with our long-term plans. So for me personally, I really had to focus on, I would have kale or celery juice smoothies with bananas. It was like this authentic nutrition. There's something about that mineral mix that really worked for me. I don't know what it was. I would find different things for different kinds of cravings. When I craved salty soup, I found that some cooked spinach and lemons would take away that craving. And when I say take away, it was not delicious in the same way that the chocolate would have been. I think when you have a chocolate bar, you get a kind of high. I don't think you're just eating to numb out. I think you're getting high with food. You don't get high when you have a kale banana smoothie, but it kind of scratches the itch and you feel content and it's much easier to surf the urge. And so all of those things matter. Minimizing your decision, taking a few decision-free breaks throughout the day, taking a 20-minute cat nap, connecting with someone that you love. The body goes into organismic distress if it feels isolated for too long. All those things make a difference. And this is actually a really good question because I used to think it was just your thinking. And I used to think that if I disempowered the excuses, that I really wouldn't have a problem. And then when I look back on how I got better, because it only takes a couple of months now for people, but when I didn't have all these tools. I spent 8 years journaling about my reptiles' excuses and what was wrong with them. And I got better. But then in retrospect, when I look at what I did, I also naturally gravitated towards more self-care. Because if I wasn't going to be binging on chocolate in the back of the 7-Eleven parking lot, then I needed something to do with my time. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, for the most part. I think everyone's different in terms of severity and impulse. So sometimes, I guess what I'm wondering is if I'm not using food, am I going to do something different that might be harmful? Like, I don't think so, but I don't know. I read a lot.
What would it be?
When I think of urge surfing, it's just a lot of adrenaline. And then to sit with discomfort with a lot of adrenaline, I don't know.
Well, okay. Your reptile, if I may be so bold as to suggest you might have one, which is true, by the way. The reason the squeals bother us so much is because there's a modicum of truth in it. Like say a half-truth and a bigger lie. The half-truth here is that you will have a surge of adrenaline that you'll have to deal with in some other way. You will. And your reptile is then saying, therefore, it won't be tolerable and you'll have to keep binging, or you're going to do something else that's really horrible.
Got it. Okay.
So then the point is, well, what are my other options? Could I do some parasympathetic breathing? Breathe in for shorter than you breathe out. Could I get outside? Could I do some yoga? Could I do some exercise? Exercise is great for adrenaline. Could I journal about it? Could I drop down and do 10 push-ups? There are a million things you can do with adrenaline besides destructive things. You'd have to have like an active list if you were worried about that. You're right to be a little worried about it and direct your energy there rather than getting symptom substitution or picking up cigarettes or,
Yeah, right.
or worse. Yeah.
This is such a mind trip. Okay. This is so cool. I am so grateful for this. Thank you.
What's making you say that right now?
I listened to you for a while and I just loved it. I honestly, just listening to other people's stories helped me a lot. And then I fell out of it because I'm studying for school and learning more about other clinical stuff. And I just fell out of it. I like it because this is kind of the first theory for me that I've really thought about and read where it's separating it from yourself, which I think is so important. And that's why the whole parts work was something I was trying to use with this because I haven't really worked on it yet. I'm doing it mostly with myself. And it's hard because part of me is thinking, well, maybe like I have an unmet need somewhere. But the bigger part of me is like, this is kind of just habit at this point. It's been like 4 years. I can't believe it's been this long with the binging, but it's habit. And I will say sometimes I don't even realize I'm doing it and I can't even remember half of what I ate. It's terrible. I think like just separating it from yourself and having a conversation with something that makes it like kind of like the enemy, I think is realistic, especially because it is that lower part of your brain that is there for survival. And, we don't need it in this modern world at all.
Well, Emily, the forces aligned against us are dramatic also. When you have billions of dollars going into making these hyperpalatable substances and they can turn off your ability to know when you're full, the same amount of money goes into advertising, or maybe not quite the same, but a lot of it. The packaged food industry is $7 trillion. The fruit and vegetables market is measured in about 1/20th that size. There's a lot more money in getting us to eat things that are packaged than what's really good for us. You've got a whole team of rocket scientists aligned against you, trying to convince you that you should just listen to the reptilian brain. We need some type of a strong defense, is my experience. Because my dad is a Gestalt therapist and my mom's a depth psychotherapist, and because I'm so attracted and fascinated by why I chose chocolate Pop-Tarts and some other people chose potato chips. You could spend a lifetime working on that and figuring out what the need was. And we did have those needs, and you do have these needs. But I found that it's much more effective to think of that endeavor as an endeavor separate and apart, the endeavor to own your disowned self and delve into your personal psychology. It's just an endeavor separate and apart from everything else. And I think that what you're saying, which is that this is just a habit, it's just a bad habit. It's actually a collection of habits. It's not just one habit. But to recognize it as a habit and then engage in very direct behavioral or cognitive behavioral interventions to fix the habit. And then if you have feelings or you're feeling you've got all these unmet needs, then go talk to a therapist about that. But the thing you really have to watch out for is the reptile saying that until you fix all these unmet psychological needs, you're going to keep binging. That game goes on forever. So that's what you got to watch out for.
I love what you said about the present. Because if we're here in the present, then there is no reptile. That was really cool.
Yes. Always use the present moment to eat healthy.
Yeah. And I've got one last thing, and this might not even relate to this. This might be more clinical, but it's kind of similar to what we talked about already. I just feel the need to talk about it again because I think this is probably the last thing that's more holding me back. With a history of so much restriction and saying no to so many things that I probably knew would like give me joy. Now I'm at this point, and it's been 4 years, but I kind of can't say no, or I will not say no. Let's say that I feel like I need to say yes or just try everything because for some reason I feel like I'm also battling this internal no that is not strong at all, but I just have this need to say yes and eat everything. Is that also, would you say, the mammal, or is that just something trying to undo something else?
But I'd call it the reptile more so than the mammal.
Hard to tell the difference sometimes.
Uh-huh. So let me just introduce a concept, which is that some people who are really frightened of anything that could become too restrictive, they can use rules, but they could use always rules. If you want to say yes to things, you could say, I always start my day with a 16-ounce green smoothie. I always write out a hypothetical food plan before I go to bed. I always take 3 deep breaths before I start my meal. I always write down 3 things I'm grateful for before I start my meal. You could make a list of things that you always do that support your mindful, focused, healthy eating. And you could focus on crowding out the bad stuff with good stuff if you want to. I've seen people do it without any restrictive rules whatsoever. I support you to do that if that is really what you want to do. I will say that I have seen in the evolution of people who are coming from where you're coming from is they'll often start with something like this. And then one of the concepts that I teach is that people ask me, how do you control emotional eating? And I say, well, it's not by fixing the emotions. It's by severing the link between the emotions and the overeating behavior. And you start out by not reifying the emotions, by not being frightened of the emotions and saying, I could feel depressed or anxious or angry. I could feel rebellious at any level. I could have these feelings and I could still follow the rule. I don't want to give this rebel more power than it deserves. But that's very frightening for people who've been through what you've been through. So I wouldn't recommend you go there right away. I would recommend you consider saying yes, developing a plan that says yes to things. See if that makes things better. And then very gradually, but very carefully, if you're going to implement anything that has any restriction whatsoever, that you look at your reaction to it and you don't make it any kind of serious restriction. If people that have a real restrictive history, I'll often have a floor for them rather than a ceiling rule. So it might be a never rule, but it'll say, I'll never have less than 500 calories for breakfast. I'll never skip a meal again. You see what I'm saying?
I do. And also, I think with the restrictive history, I think some of that is kind of ingrained. So even though I will eat some stuff, I think it's unconsciously restrictive, and that's probably why it's an overboard thing.
Restrictive rules are kind of like sharp kitchen knives, and you could use them to chop vegetables or you could use them to do damage. And so I wouldn't start using a sharp kitchen knife until you feel like you really know how to use it and you're not tempted to use it to do damage.
Okay. So I guess going off of that, I need to read your book. I've got your workbook. In all honesty, I'm finishing up a dual grad program. I graduate in December, so I might not be able to get too far into it in the next 2 months. But I'm sure once December comes, that is something I will read first. So for now, if you were to recommend something, I know it's my journey. Is this something I'd love to try? You said you would not recommend doing rules.
I would consider a rule, but I consider something that was an always rule rather than a never rule. Like if there was something that you always did every day.
I'm a functioning human with normal labs. I've just gained like 30 something pounds in a matter of a couple of years, and I need to catch my health back in check.
What's the simplest, easiest thing that you could do? Just say the first thing that comes to mind, which wouldn't be too burdensome. It's kind of a low bar, but it'd make a difference so that a year from now, if that's all you did, you'd say, I've got a somewhat different life because I did this.
I don't have anything small, and that's, I think, probably the issue. I have consistency. I think if I was just consistent, like, don't we all say that?
If you consistently did what?
For me, I think what works for me is eating 4 meals a day, not skipping a meal. What I don't do and need to do is sit down when I eat and use utensils. That's something that doesn't always happen. Not eating meals less than 3 hours apart.
Can you get 4 meals a day in at 3 hours apart?
Yeah.
So if you said that you were always going to have 4 meals, if that was your center, how does that feel?
That's what I've been doing right now for the most part. And then I'll overdo it at night sometimes and then skip the next day. That sounds realistic and achievable long term because I get up at like 4, I'm up until 10.
What if you always had 4 meals and you didn't skip it the next day if you ate too much at dinner?
Usually, when I'm eating too much at dinner, I'm standing and not eating with utensils or on a plate. So they all go together. But yes, you're right.
I don't want to dictate to you at all. I think it's important you don't feel dictated to. I think you need to find something that really works for you. I'm just speculating. When people allow themselves to skip meals, they're kind of setting themselves up to have too much later on. And your reptile knows that you could skip breakfast tomorrow. So it says you can get away with a bigger dinner. It kind of feeds into that cycle. Is it too harsh? Is it too much of a rule?
No, I think I'm at a point where I really need set rules because the nuance makes me play with myself in my head and I will make deals. Like, oh, I'll just eat this now and then I'll just do this tomorrow. Or, yeah, like I think I need a set rule. I just don't know the line between what is going to screw me up later, what is realistic, and how can I maintain it. And maybe it's just the pig squeal.
Emily, how would it screw you up later if you always had 4 meals a day?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I think if I had more or overeat without these rules, at least right now, what screws me up or what being a victim of my own self, if I mess one little thing up, then it's like I slash all four tires instead of just having one tire I could fix. Instead of spending $10, let's just blow our whole bank account. It's like that kind of thing. Not really at all financially, but
So you're reluctant to have any rules because if you break them, then you're going to go to town. It's like if you run a red light, you're going to run all of them.
yeah, it's only for food. It's not anywhere else in my life. That's why I love the whole bank metaphor because I would never do that except with food. Yeah, if I go like 200 calories over, I'm going to eat like 5,000. I don't understand it.
Have you heard me talk about committing with perfection but forgiving yourself with dignity?
Probably, but it has not ingrained in my brain.
I know this is kind of being very vulnerable and you're facing a lot of anxiety here. Do you have it in you to hear about one more concept?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you can give me everything you want.
Okay. The reptile tells us we should use progress, not perfection, that we shouldn't commit to anything with perfection like a rule, because if we make a mistake, we're just going to beat ourselves up and it's going to be an excuse to binge more. What I want you to understand is that it will switch and use perfectionism after you make a mistake. Because if you do make a mistake, let's say you accidentally skip a meal, it'll say, see, you're not perfect, therefore you're nothing. You're really pathetic. You can't follow any rule whatsoever. Therefore, you should just binge. So even though the pig is saying perfectionism is the enemy, it actually uses perfectionism. It's just using it after the mistake instead of before the mistake. And when you look at the psychology of winners, how people accomplish goals, they actually do leverage the energy and perfectionism to aim at the target. Because when you're aiming at the target, if you're thinking, maybe I'll make it, maybe I won't, progress, not perfection, really what you're thinking is just try for a little while until I don't feel like it anymore. So there's almost no other option than to really aim with perfection. But if you miss the target, then the idea is to switch to by how much, in what direction, and what can I learn from this? How do I aim better? You turn the guilt into responsibility, and then you let go of the guilt. That's how you make progress. You collect evidence of success. The pig's perfectionism after the mistake only serves to wear you down so you're too weak to resist the next binge. You can't escape the use of perfectionism. You can only consciously decide when to apply it, and we apply it in the opposite way than the reptile does. I'm sorry if I said pig.
It's just for other people, but no, I don't care.
Okay. Did that make sense what I said?
Yes, it does.
The other thing is that I consider every rule in the Defeat Your Craving system to be preceded by the words consciously and purposefully. If you say, I will always eat 4 meals per day, I think what you're really saying is I will always consciously and purposely eat 4 meals per day. The reason that's important is something comes up, you forgot, legitimately, not because you wanted to forget, but because you forgot. The reptile can't then say, hey, Emily, you screwed up, you're off the plan, see, you're nothing. You can say, no, I made a mistake. It was an unconscious mistake. I didn't break the plan. If I skip the next meal, then I broke the plan. Having that consciously and purposefully clause, it kind of softens the use of the rule and it makes it harder for the pig to use perfectionism against you. I want you to think about all this really carefully before you implement it. I know that this is radically different.
I'm taking notes. I've heard about it the past month or so. I have a long commute when I go to work. I know I need to do something, and I think this would really work, to be honest. We all want like a magic pill or magic button to be like, fix me. I love the stuff you say. I resonate with it a lot, and I think it's really realistic. Like, I wanted this call as well because I don't know, I have a lot of pressure on myself, period, but to be a future practitioner and what I think I need to be an example and also have this issue. And then, like, I don't mind the pig at all. I know other people, I guess this is just, I
No,
know,
we'll call it the reptile for you. It's equally as effective.
okay.
The pig is just what I called it almost 20 years ago because I'm a weirdo.
No,
I just,
I think it works for me too. I just like clinically and how the world is right now. And
If I was presenting at a professional conference, I don't know if I would say that it was a pig.
Okay. Okay, cool. I guess that's okay.
I do have a million readers in Psychology Today, and I have talked about it like that there, but I guess that's not the same as a professional journal or anyway.
That's too bad though, because it works for you and you're explaining it and they're like, hey, it's so mean. Don't do that.
I think that the shock value of it is part of why it caught on, why I had so many people read it.
I will say that's what got my attention because it was like, wow, you're actually like using a different part of yourself and it's not you. You're not broken. It's that other part.
And if you listen to the coaching sessions, people tell me they can hear the compassion in my voice. I'm really not putting people down.
And I think it's good to make it humorous. We need that kind of as funny to a degree.
Thanks, Emily.
This whole thing too. I mean, not you, but binging. Like I will eat just dry rice and my boyfriend will laugh at me. And it's kind of not funny, but after 4 years, it's like, seriously, don't eat dry rice.
It becomes funnier when you're past it. When you don't do it anymore, then you can laugh about it. When you're in the middle of it, it's a nightmare.
Yeah, and I think I'm to the point, like, I don't have a lot of guilt. I think I'm just frustrated and it's kind of like, well, what else to do? Because it's been such a normal pattern of my life. I kind of don't really know how to just snap it. So what book would you recommend? You mentioned a newer one.
Yeah, the new book is called Defeat Your Cravings. You can get it for free at defeatyourcravings.com. I don't have the Audible out yet. I'm recording it next week, so within a month or so, we'll have the Audible. Like for people like you who have a long commute but don't have reading time, I know what it's like to be in graduate school. Yeah, we'll have the Audible book out soon, and that's the most up-to-date book. That incorporates all of my best thinking about how to fix your thinking about food, but also how to stop the screw it, just do it response from interfering with all the reasons we talked about before.
Screw it, just do it. That's a really good little jingle.
We've talked to about 2,000 people over the last 8 years, so we've heard it all.
Okay, so do you think that book would just be fine enough, or should I start with your first one?
No. I actually recommend people not to read the old ones and to study the new one instead. It's got the best of the old stuff.
Thanks so much. And I do have your workbook. I will open that probably tonight.
Good.
Thanks for doing this. This was really genius, kind of how I've read so many books and I've done so much research on binging and looked at so many counselors and outpatient treatment. And this is just a really cool concept. And I really think it would be effective because it was for a couple of weeks when I listened to podcasts.
It's really effective. And our most successful people, they listen to at least one podcast a week in the long run when we do surveys. It's a different philosophy and you're immersed in the culture and very different ideas than what we find actually works. And so if it works for you, it's one of the reasons I have the podcast is so that people can listen to it over and over again. For those of you who are listening on the radio and aren't subscribed to the podcast, you can get the podcast at defeatyourcravingspodcast.com. So you can never miss an episode. Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of today's broadcast of Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston. If you'd like to find out more about the products and services Dr. Glenn offers to help you dramatically reduce your cravings and stop overeating in 90 days or less, please visit defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. That's defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. Thanks.